Thank you very much for inviting us to present this paper. This work is joined with Tristan Reed, who's at the World Bank in the research group, and I will present and Tristan will take questions at the end. So this is a very broad topic and I have a lot of ground to cover. So let me try to summarize the main findings. There is much more in the paper. The main expectation in the early months of 2020 was that developing countries would be hit much harder by the coronavirus, both on the public health front and on the economic front. And I was one among many who predicted that the effects would be catastrophic in developing countries. As was pointed out earlier in other sessions in the morning, we're still at a time where we all face high uncertainty. So this is one of the challenges of this conference. We can all be proven completely wrong. Nevertheless, in the spirit of what Claudia said, I still think it's useful to take stock of where we are now. And when we try to take stock of where we are with respect to developing countries, our message with Tristan is a little more optimistic than the general view. We find that developing countries are doing relatively well, both on the public health front and on the economic front. And when I say well, I mean relative to expectations, which were very grim to start with, and also relative to advanced countries. I will caveat what I said by pointing out that there is, of course, high uncertainty about the future. We don't know what the course of the pandemic is. And also by pointing out that our optimism refers to the short run. We are substantially more pessimistic about the long run, both because of the effects that the pandemic has on human capital and also because of the general trend towards deglobalization, and I will talk about this towards the end. So let me get straight to the findings now. One more caveat. Whenever one talks about developing countries, one faces the challenge that this is a very heterogeneous set of countries. So here I'm going to lump together countries like Vietnam or China that have fared fairly well with Brazil. So I'm going to make general statements about averages, but the caveat I just mentioned, of course, applies. So let me start with the public health front. At the outset, there were some reasons to be optimistic about developing countries and also many to be pessimistic. The main reasons for optimism were the age distribution and the low rates of obesity, both of which were identified as risk factors. Some speculated that weather might play a role. Low connectivity might have also been an advantage, surprisingly, but it meant that the virus arrived relatively late in developing countries. There were many more reasons to be pessimistic, most importantly, that most developing countries have no capacity in their healthcare systems. And that's the main reason that many of us expected devastating effects. And in addition, most people live in crowded spaces. There is urban poverty. Households live in multi-generational, households are multi-generational for the most part, and that might make policies that were implemented with relative success in richer countries less effective. So here's what we find when we look at this. These are data as of June 20th. We focus on one particular outcome variable, which is deaths per million people. So we focus on mortality. And the reason we do that is because the death statistics are more reliable than any other statistics. We know that testing has not been random. So when you look at cases or any other measures, selection issues turn out to be very important. I will come back to the data if I have time, but for now, let's look at these death statistics. The top curve in red shows the pattern for the high income countries. There is this curve. This is the curve for the upper middle income countries. In this curve, we excluded China. If you include China, this curve becomes very flat, and that might conceal the pattern for other countries. And down here are China, the lower middle income countries, and also the low income countries. And there are three things that are apparent. First, developing countries start having deaths much later than advanced economies. Second, the curves look very different. So the curves for lower income countries are both lower and much flatter. And no matter what concerns you have about data, and I'm sure you have many, I think the pattern, this difference is so strong that one cannot deny that there is a difference there. Perhaps a different way to portray this difference is by looking at by taking a snapshot of deaths per million and plot them against GDP per capita, which is what we did in this graph. The US is normalized to be 1. And again, you see a very strong positive relationship between GDP per capita and deaths per million. And that may catch someone by surprise, because most of us might have expected the opposite. We know from evidence within countries, and in particular within municipalities, we know from what happened in the US, let's say in New York City or in Detroit, that it's mostly the socioeconomically disadvantaged groups that suffer the most. So if you extrapolate it from these within country findings to the international setting, you would expect the opposite. That said, and Jan pointed that out to us earlier when she read an earlier draft, actually within the United States, we see a little bit of the same pattern, in the sense that in some of the richer states like New York State was devastated. And yet, so the spatial pattern tends to be different sometimes from the within municipality pattern. We think this is quite interesting because it can both inform epidemiological models, but also it speaks to the political economy of the response, and perhaps most importantly of the resistance to the response. As I said earlier, I'm sure you have many concerns about the data, and these are discussed in the paper. But I just want to point out that the differences are so big that it's very hard to explain them through measurement error or data manipulation alone. And here is a list of some of the numbers as they look for particular countries, just to give you a sense of what the difference in magnitudes is. So in Europe, that's where you have the highest numbers. So for example, in the UK, you have approximately 635 deaths per million. Germany is at the other end. Germany is a country that did very well with 107. This is one of the best performing countries in Europe. Now, if you go to Asia here, so I put Turkey here because it's right between Europe and Asia. Part of it is in Europe. You only have 60 deaths per million. If you go to India, the Philippines, Indonesia, these numbers are really very small. So India is growing right now. The rising cases and rising deaths, but even so, it will take a very long time and a very fast acceleration of the pattern to catch up in the negative sense with richer countries. This is the Americas. This is Latin America, where the coronavirus is ravaging the countries right now, and you can see higher numbers and also increasing numbers over time. So it's very likely that Brazil in particular is going to catch up. But even so, there are many other smaller countries in this category of upper middle income countries that don't show such rising deaths. By the way, these are the countries that account for most of the deaths, of the rising deaths in upper middle income countries. And this is Africa, where again, the numbers are tiny. South Africa has the largest death toll. For most of the countries, the numbers look like Nigeria or Angola, and these again are very populous countries. That's why we picked them here. So there is this positive correlation, which seems a bit of a puzzle. And then what we try to do next in the paper is try to unpack it. So we run various cross-country regressions. To be clear, these are cross-country regressions with all the usual caveats that apply to such regressions. And it's pure data mining. There is no theory behind them. So we try to, in some sense, to capture through these regressions what I'm sure all of us have been doing over the past few months, which is staring at tables and curves and try to make sense of these. So this is trying to put all these in regressions. So again, there are about 30 covariates that we use and about 30 regressions, various combinations that are in the paper and in the data appendix. And let me here summarize some of the main findings of this work, of this exercise. So first, if you just regress in log terms, COVID deaths per billion, we do everything in log scale. Against log GDP, you find this very strong positive coefficient. This reflects what I showed you earlier in the graph. The first thing we do is to then account for the time since the first death. We also tried alternative measures, so time since first 10 cases, it didn't make a difference. And the reason we do that is because this correlation could be mechanical. It could be mechanical because we know that developing countries started having cases and deaths later. So it could be just a mechanical effect. As you wait longer, you accumulate deaths. And now let me say that this particular variable, it should itself be an object of interest. So eventually, one day, hopefully when this is over, you would like to take it out of these regressions and run them without it, or you would like to really understand what lies behind it. So why is it that some countries started later? But for now, we thought we really need it, because without this, this correlation seems implausibly large. Once we control, as you would expect, the impact of income goes way down. So a large part, and the R-square also jumps up. So a lot of what we see in developing countries, it's simply explained by the fact that for whatever reason, it could be policy, it could be luck, it could be low connectivity, they started having cases later. Nevertheless, the effect of income remains. Next, we put two covariates that have been suggested in the literature as being important. One is the percentage of population over 70, and the other one is obesity prevalence. And both of them enter positively and significant. And once you put them in, the coefficient of income becomes much smaller and statistically insignificant. And let me just say, among the various specifications we run, these are the two effects that remained throughout robust. We cannot kill them. Anything, no matter what we do, we cannot kill them. Among other things, we put various health covariates, as you would expect, prevalence of diabetes, smoking, proxies for pollution, and so on. All of them were found to be insignificant once we have obesity here. So what this tells us is that these two variables are quite important. We wouldn't like to interpret them as suggesting that they completely explain cross-country variation. Remember that this time effect remains very large and significant. Nevertheless, they seem to have a very important effect. Another specification we tried is many specifications are specifications that include various policy variables, and we have very detailed policy variables from the Oxford database. The one that we found in earlier specifications to be most promising was a proxy for early action. So how many days did it take before countries took the first action? And in the latest data, in the latest regressions we run, this turns out to be insignificant. On the other hand, once we put another variable in, the population density in the largest urban center, interestingly, we find that this variable has a very large impact on deaths, as you would expect. The denser cities are, the more deaths you have. But once you put density in, the coefficient on income becomes again positive and significant. And what this tells us is that developing countries have done relatively well despite having very dense cities. And that again poses a bit of a puzzle. So we have cities like Nairobi and Lagos and Manila. And Manila was exposed very early, and yet you don't see a very high number of deaths. So specification 10 is actually our preferred specification because we want to include the population density. This seems to be very important. And so the main takeaway from this column is that, yes, time since first death matters. Age and obesity are extremely important. These are the two covariates that we always find to be important, and so is population density. There is still a fraction that we cannot explain. And whatever the reason for that is, it's actually good news for developing countries because it means that fewer lives were lost. So this is one more thought before I go on. What about policy? Perhaps it's a bit unsettling that we consistently find that policies are not important, various measures of policy. One interpretation is that policy mattered, but in a much more subtle and nuanced way as we capture here. And just to give you one example, the stringency index for countries like Germany and the US is approximately the same. But there were huge differences in the way policies were implemented in the two countries. And this is perhaps something we are not capturing here. Interestingly, we found that if we put measures of mobility, we do find that as mobility declines, then deaths also decline. So the effect goes in the way you would expect. However, that doesn't explain the difference in developing countries. And this is partly because there is other work that has shown that in many developing countries, despite strict containment measures, mobility did not decrease as much as in more advanced countries. This can be partly attributed to the informal sector. So what are the tentative conclusions from that? Tentatively, we say we find that developing countries have done well. This may change in the future. But what this implies is that perhaps they can start to cautiously ease lockdowns while remaining vigilant in order to avoid importing infections, and testing and tracing going forward is going to be important. Next, we look at the economic effects. And when it comes to the economic effects, we start by looking at the external exposure that developing countries have. And we start by focusing on financial data for the simple reason that financial data is available compared to data on macro variables. And I'll try to tell you the story in a few graphs. This graph shows the net non-resident portfolio flows. The source is the Institute of International Finance, and this is going to be the source for many of the graphs that I'm going to show you. These are the outflows in March that set markets in panic. These outflows were truly unprecedented. They were on the order. So this is a subset of markets. These are all the major emerging markets. It was about 80 billion for the markets that I show you. It was a 100 total. However, and then now comes the perhaps more optimistic message. If you look at a more general measure of capital outflows, so net capital outflows that include, in addition to stocks and bonds, also foreign direct investment and bank flows, then that's the picture that emerges. And I'm sure Shepner will talk about this, but this is a subset of emerging markets. These are just 12 markets, and these are, again, estimates from the Institute of International Finance, but actually these are estimates in the past have done very well in terms of comparison to balance of payments data. And when you look at this graph, there are a few things to point out. The first is that, again, you see these very large outflows. They are very large, but I would no longer characterize them as unprecedented. They're in about of the same order of magnitude as what happened in 2015 during the commodity price bust at that time. So more importantly, we also plotted here the price of oil. And you can see that these big capital outflows trace very closely the price of oil. So that looks very much like a commodity price bust rather than just the coronavirus crisis. And the oil price shock itself was the result of two different shocks. There was, of course, the demand shock during the coronavirus crisis, but there is also a supply shock due to the fact that there was price war between Saudi Arabia and Russia. And of course, you're going to say this is partly because of the demand, the anticipated decline in demand, but nevertheless, the relationship with Russia was very strained. So our takeaway from this picture is not, I'm sorry, that things look good, they look bad, but they're as bad as they've always looked. That's perhaps one way to interpret the graph. On the right, we show what the accumulated net flows have been over the most recent year for several countries. And what's interesting is, so the biggest outflows are for Saudi Arabia. This is consistent with a view that the oil price shock played a very important role in this crisis. But the other interesting thing, and that's perhaps the more optimistic part of our message, is for many countries, you see still that a net positive despite what happened. In the paper, we look at next at the borrowing costs. One proxy of this borrowing cost is the hard currency bond spreads. These have increased dramatically in the year in March, subsequently came down, up again after debt forbearance was announced. And since then, they have come down. So again, financial markets seem to be doing a little better than before. That's a good thing for developing countries. Nevertheless, what's striking is how much borrowing costs have increased. And to us, that's the biggest alarming message. I also want to use this graph to make one more point. This is the time, this at the peak, this is when the G20 announced its conference call, and subsequently the bond spreads came down. That showed that this initiative calmed down markets. Then here in April, late April, the G20 announces the debt standstill, and immediately afterwards, the spreads increase again. Why? Because the markets priced in the risk, the increased risk. This was perceived as increased risk. And since then, even though 77 countries are eligible to request forbearance, according to the IMF, there are only 22 countries that have requested to do so. And they always cite, the main reason they cite for not having taken advantage of this initiative is that they're afraid that they're going to be downgraded. Their credit ratings are going to go down. So that shows that there is a trade-off between initiatives to give debt relief to developing countries and the higher borrowing costs they face, and risks about downgrading. And these are concerns that are very much in the minds of developing countries. Commodity prices, again, there the picture looks better than before. They came very sharply down. The oil was the major driver. But since then, they have come up and they look better than before. And so if we ask in the end, how large is the external exposure of developing countries, ultimately, it's the countries that are very rich in natural resources, so especially oil, and these are low-income countries. This is where the biggest vulnerability is. And of course, remittances are another issue. This is only the financial side. Then we come to the economic effects, and there the main effects came from countries' own containment policies. We don't have official data yet. We have many estimates, but we have many surveys, especially phone surveys. And the picture that emerges is very similar to the picture that the last paper in this conference presented. People report large employment and income losses. So even in countries that have very few deaths, many people report difficulty meeting basic nutritional needs. Countries report food insecurity. There is disruption also in education and basic routine healthcare, and also people report increases in domestic violence. So the picture that emerges from surveys is a much more somber picture. Finally, when it comes to the long run, there we can only speculate. We don't have data. And this is where we are most pessimistic. And there are two main reasons for our pessimism. The first is there have been, during this period, there have been many school closures and disruption of routine healthcare. And these are painful in every country, but they're particularly painful with potentially long-run detrimental effect in developing countries. For example, in the case of schools, we know from the Ebola crisis that when schools closed, many girls didn't come back. They got married, they had kids. So the effect on the education of girls and women could be very important. Similarly, when it comes to routine healthcare, there are many concerns that maternal and child mortality will go up. There are vaccinations that are getting missed. So that's the first concern that we have. The second one comes from the fact that the current crisis has accelerated, I wouldn't say it has generated, but it has accelerated a pre-existing trend towards deglobalization. And what I mean by that is, of course, all the sentiment against immigrants, against trade. But even if you abstract from these two, there is much less willingness now in many advanced countries to help developing countries. And we are at a point in time where developing countries desperately need this help. So I will conclude with some final thoughts on policy implications. So our record of how developing countries have done so far seems better relative to expectations. Nevertheless, there is still very considerable economic fallout and a lot of uncertainty about the future. So the thing that's clear is that countries will need stimulus. Monetary stimulus doesn't do much in most developing countries. You need fiscal stimulus, but in most countries, there is no fiscal space. So external help will be needed. But as I said before, there is very little willingness to help. And that's the main reason to be concerned. Debt relief will be needed for many countries, but there again, there are many questions for whom. Many countries are facing insolvency, but is that the result of the COVID crisis, or is it the result of pre-existing long-term structural issues? In general, as the interest rates, as the spreads show, there is a trade-off between providing substantive debt relief and countries facing a further increase in borrowing costs or further capital outflows. And so against this background, the standstill seems like a good idea in the sense that it buys everyone time to figure out what to do, but it's absolutely clear that it's not going to be sufficient. So I will stop here. Thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to your comments.
Okay, so we have two discussants. So Şebnem Kalemli-Özcan, you're up first.
Okay, let me share my screen. It says I cannot share my screen. Okay, let me try. Yeah. Okay, I hope everybody can see and hear. Thank you very much for the organizers for inviting me to discuss this extremely interesting paper. Let me start with a very brief overview. The key message of Goldberg and Reed is, as of June 22nd, 2020, emerging markets and developing countries have fared relatively well. The authors investigate the impact of COVID on these group of countries on two fronts. On the public health front, they show that these countries experience a lower number of deaths, and this can be explained by their younger population and lower obesity rates. On the economic front, the short-term economic effects are limited and economic recovery is underway. There can be devastating effects in terms of medium and long run, and these effects are going to be directly due to containment policies through output and indirect effects on education and health. The authors realize that we live in extremely high uncertain environment, and they caution that paper's conclusion can be reversed if infection and deaths accelerate in emerging markets and developing economies. My comments is going to be on 3 points. First, I do agree with the authors that death is a useful metric, but I would like to look another metric to evaluate the short-term public health impact. My second point is going to be on whether we can explain low deaths in emerging markets and developing economies with some other factors too. I agree with them that demographics and health are going to be powerful variables, but of course these variables don't let themselves to policy response. So I would like to dig a little bit in deeper in terms of other variables that we can devise policies for. And my third comment is going to be revisit the nature of the COVID shock for this group of countries. Instead of just focusing it as a commodity price shock, it is a shock with many layers. And by doing this, I will try to come up with alternative ways to evaluate the economic impact, both short-term and medium-term. And here I'm going to use both some data as much as I can, real-time data and model-based estimates. And we'll draw lessons from history. So my discussion is going to be a cautious view from an optimist. I am known as an optimist, but I believe what we have learned since February is we are always behind as far as this pandemic goes, and COVID is ahead, and we hope for the best. And I do hope the authors' results survive the next 6 months, but we do have to prepare for the worst. So let me start with my first comment on the metric. The authors, as you just saw, focus on the deaths per million, which is a very useful metric, no doubt. But I would like to look at also cases, because I believe there is information in cases. So this is a figure that I'm sure you've seen many times in press on the daily new COVID cases. The figure on the left is an update from June 22. So this is data from Johns Hopkins. And you can clearly see the alarming increase in daily new cases on emerging market and developed economies. Yellow line, the upward trajectory of the yellow line. Red line is China. And the dark blue is the advanced economies. So these numbers might be off, but the point is this difference, which is very critical for us, is not likely to be that off. Where the advanced economies turn their curve, there's now a little uptick due to the recent increases, mainly in US, and these guys are really on an upward trajectory. This becomes really impressive when you compare this figure to slightly older version of the same exact data. This is from Martin Wolf's FD column on June 9. It's exactly the same data. You see the same pattern. Advanced economies have their curve in terms of new cases with pink. Emerging markets are really increasing, not almost surpassed, shown with the blue line. But notice that the number here is 80,000 cases as of May 27, and in just a couple of weeks, in a very short time, now we are at a number 120,000. Again, I mean, given this picture, it is going to be extremely interesting to see if emerging markets and developed economies can keep the low number of deaths, because that means we really have to learn from these guys, right? And in that sense, this paper is extremely important and timely because it makes us think really what is going on. So this brings me to my second comment. Why do rich countries have more debts? I would like to show you two figures here. So this figure on the left is a visual representation of author's headline result, which says, look, there is an extremely strong correlation between COVID deaths per million and the GDP per capita in cross-country regression. And, certain variables can explain that, size of the countries given with the bubble. Rich countries have more debts. This figure on the right is from the work of my colleagues at the fund, shows the opposite result for counties. Now, this controls the state fixed effect, so you don't have a New York effect here, but this is the US countries that tells you deaths are lower in rich countries. And here I use the poverty rate for county that tells you that poorer the country, more deaths there. And I believe now there's actually recent work from Europe looking at European regions and at a very granular level showing the same result. Although we have Lombardis and New Yorks of the world, it looks like spatial patterns when you look at really detail tells you that being rich is actually a good thing in terms of reducing the debt. So what is going on? So clearly there is this thing that GDP proxies for in cross-country regression. Paper's headline on this is older population, high obesity rates are the key variables. These are the variables that render GDP insignificant. So they are the ones GDP is proxying for. Of course, any X variable that is positively correlated with GDP and has a positive beta on the debt is going to create an upward omitted variable bias. This goes with any variable negatively correlated with GDP and has a negative effect on COVID deaths like testing and contact tracing. That's also going to create an omitted variable bias. The usual suspect we all think is this is about delay in policy action, disease arrived late in emerging markets and developing economies, that must be it. Authors look into that and these are important but not enough to explain away the role of demographics and health. Other suspects seem like in paper's robustness test is about testing and tracing variable. And this is really exciting for me because I do think we should be doing more in terms of testing and tracing. And knowing that these variables are also impactful is important. These variables can explain the positive relationship between GDP and debt. Now, it is very hard to interpret these variables, as the authors pointed out. Testing is not random. There are only 3 countries with random testing. But maybe it is better testing capacity, or maybe it's misreporting. It can go either way. My favorite interpretation is it can be that there's better contact tracing in emerging markets and developed economies because of limited civil liberties. For those of us who are from these countries, and I'm being one, we know that it is pretty easy for governments to track people in these countries. So I'm going to revisit their results. So they graciously provided their data. I'm running their exact same regression here. I'm regressing their debt variable on GDP per capita, and then the mechanical variable, which is very important. And then I purposefully omit the demographic and health variables, and I put this group of testing variables, which seem very important, especially the contact tracing variable you can see in red has a negative effect on number of deaths and actually renders the positive correlation between GDP per capita and deaths is practically insignificant. The same effect that obesity and young people have. So this is really good news because this is something then we can pursue in terms of public health policies. And this is consistent with our anecdotal observation of South Korea and Germany, right? South Korea and Germany, there's nothing going on in terms of income differences. They both did this very well. Okay. Now, my final point is going to be on the nature of COVID shock and the economic impact. This shock is a multitude of shocks. So it is a health shock, supply shock, and demand shock for everybody. But for emerging markets and developing economies, it's also a capital flow shock, an exchange rate shock, and a commodity price shock. Paper does a very good job on focusing the commodity price side, and I fully agree with those results, but I would say it is much bigger than that, especially for many emerging markets and developed economies that are going to be commodity importers, not exporters. They are going to be hit from the other layers and not through the commodity price side. And of course, we all want real-time macroeconomic data. We are not going to get this. second quarter GDP, and very important balance of payments, capital flows data is not available. Still, this is a large crisis, and all crisis requires out-of-the-box policy response, so we should, do these papers. So what I'm going to do as an alternative to the paper, I'm going to try to look at inference from almost real-time data and some model-based estimate where the model is an epidemiological macro model specifically done for an emerging market. First, let me look at an almost real-time data. This is PMI survey. It tracks industrial production with 1 month lead. So industrial production numbers now we have is only April. This is also we have for May. What you see here is both manufacturing and services extreme contraction. This is a survey that tells you there's contraction when the numbers are less than 50. This is this dotted black line. You see that contraction in both sectors. More importantly, you see that there is no difference between advanced economies and emerging market and developed economies. They are contracting the same way. In March, shown with green bars, maybe EMDE countries were a little better, but in April and May, practically there is no more difference between advanced economies and emerging market and developing economies, both in manufacturing and services in terms of economic contraction. Now, the latest VO from yesterday, compared to April VO, World Economic Outlook, IMF is projecting a much deeper recession in 2020 and a slow recovery in 2021. They came loud and clear yesterday as no country is spared. Global growth is expected to decline minus 4.9%. The number for this group of countries, the paper is considered with is minus 3. If you exclude China, it's minus 5, right where the global growth is. Gita said yesterday the cumulative hit to GDP growth over 2020, 2021 in this group of EMDE countries the paper is focusing on is going to be worse than the advanced economies. It's expected to exceed that in advanced economies. Of course, we all realize there's a high degree of uncertainty and countries should be agile with their policies and adapt to changing environment. In this juncture, I put the key important variable as the capital flows and external financing for this set of countries, for EMDE countries. Now, let me tell you very quickly what is wrong with the capital flows data we have. The high frequency real-time capital flows data is only on portfolio equity and portfolio debt. And this unprecedented capital outflows we see now everywhere, and Penny also showed the minus 80 number, which is minus 100 billion for equity and minus 30 billion for debt. Now, we don't really care about this number, do we? Because this is not an important class at all for this group of countries in their external borrowing. Actually, if you look at developing economies, now if you separate these emerging markets and developed economies, and the separation is going to be very important here, it doesn't matter for developed economies at all. And for emerging markets, it's going to be a very tiny piece of external financing. Portfolio that is going to be mainly about sovereign borrowing. It's completely fine that investors leaving the sovereign debt because they expect a sovereign default, and they leave equity because it's the riskiest class. Authors realize this. They use a broader measure of net capital flows that is going to incorporate everything, banking, loans, bonds, FDI. But unfortunately, this is only for 12 countries. And again, account identity. It is trade balance and the reserves. But we learn from all the previous episodes of sudden stops and crisis. So all the previous episodes of sudden stop, crisis in all the emerging markets and developed economies, this doesn't matter. What matters is gross capital flows, what foreigners do, not the net, because net will be what foreigners do minus what domestics do. What matters is what foreigners do, non-resident, which is the portfolio data we have, and especially banks. So if we look at the real data over 34 emerging markets and developed economies from previous two big events, global financial crisis during the fourth quarter of 2008 and taper tantrum. So you see that this is the very negative bar, by the way, much larger numbers we are looking at here, much larger than what we see now. You can see what we see here is like the big blood is out of the private sector. So this is how much the banking sector and this is how much the corporate sector loses in these 34 countries. And you can see that sovereign is just lost a little bit. And this is going to be consistent with what we've seen so far. Taper tantrum, another very big exogenous event for emerging market developed economies. Third quarter of 2013, the same story. Nothing is going on with the sovereigns then, and it's a lot of capital flows came out of the banking and the corporate sectors of the emerging market of developing economies. Now for COVID, we can only do the first quarter of 2020 with the recently release of the BIS data and aggregating up the micro data on loans and bonds. And again, actually, what you see is this very little in the sovereign bonds and as matching the real-time data. But then in terms of the private flows, they are still borrowing. In the first quarter of this year, both corporate sector and the banking sector in the 34 representative emerging market and developing economies still borrowing. So it is too early to tell, to know what is going to happen with capital flows moving forward without having the actual bills of payment data and second quarter now.
Okay, so Şebnem, we need to wrap up here.
Yes, my last point. In terms of the medium and long-run effects and the effect of lockdown policies, what I would like to say is recovery of local demand and effect of lockdown policies is going to be very important, as the author is saying, but that's going to depend on foreign demand, international linkages, and external finance. And the model we did, an epidemiological macro model, shows that partial lockdown policies are going to give you higher losses than the full lockdown because of the importance of domestic and external demand. Let me wrap up. So this is a heroic effort to evaluate the health and economic impact of COVID on emerging markets and developed economies for such a large and uncertain shock. Global epicenter is moving to south, and if that remains low, this will be a big success for EMDEs, and it will provide valuable lessons. There are still a lot of known unknowns and many uncertainties in terms of which factors make people vulnerable, how epidemiology linked to economic outcomes, and more conferences like this. Hopefully we will learn more and be ahead of the disease at some point. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks very much. Michael Kramer.
Great, thanks very much. Oh no, great. So it's a pleasure to discuss this paper. I think it makes two very nice claims. First, it documents very convincingly that there are fewer COVID-19 deaths in lower income countries. And second, it argues that many of the economic costs of the epidemic are less severe than anticipated, but that the containment policies have had large costs. And the potential policy implication is that perhaps we should be relaxing some of these lockdown policies. I'll argue that understanding the reason why we have fewer deaths in lower income countries is critical for policy. Goldberg and Reed focus on demographics and obesity. I'm going to argue, as I think Penny acknowledged, that there may be more to it than that, and there's a deeper puzzle. I also wanted to make a bit of a note on methodology. So when epidemiologists, and I'll focus really on the first part of the paper, the epidemiological part, but epidemiologists, they typically use models and they calibrate those models, much like macroeconomists do. They'll calibrate things using microdata. This paper has a complementary approach of using cross-country data, and I think there are advantages to combining them. I think this paper brings some insights to bear that of some issues that might be there with just a standard epidemiological approach, but I think the epidemiological approach also, it's useful to bring some of that into this paper, bring in some of those models. So I'll try to do that. So let me start with the sort of canonical epidemiological model for diseases like COVID-19, which is the SIR, or susceptible, infected, recovered model, which I think maybe economists wouldn't have known about before, but now I think probably most people are familiar with these equations. So the change in the susceptible—
Michael, if you're referring to slides, we can't see your slides.
Oh, I've been trying to share my slides throughout.
That's okay, but you've been very articulate until we start talking about SIR equations.
Okay, why are my slides not being, okay, I'm going to get some tech assistance here.
Well, I'm sure you can be articulate talking about SIR equations too.
Hey, Michael, this is Anna. I'm going to pull up your slides from my computer, so hopefully you can see them.
Oh, it's okay. I just forgot to click screen. Yeah. Gosh, I thought I could do it. Oh, picture. There we go. I think, are my slides up now?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. Thanks a lot. Okay. Now let me just see if I can go to the the view that'll focus in on them. Okay. So the change in the number of susceptible people happens when a susceptible person meets an infected person. And then there's transmission with a probability beta. And N is just the population, which you can think of as normalizing to 1. What's the change in the number of infected people? Well, the number of infected people grows when when there's an infection event, and then you have to subtract off the rate at which infected people recover, which is gamma. I'll ignore deaths here. And the change in the number of recovered people is just the gamma, the recovery rate times the number of infected. This is a standard model. The R0, which is the number of people each infected person infects in a naive population, is beta over gamma. So if beta over gamma is greater than 1, then the disease is going to spread. If beta over gamma is less than 1, the disease will not take off. And you can estimate R0 by looking at the initial doubling time. And people have done this, and they take the data from Wuhan, they take the data from Lombardy, and you get pretty high rate of R0, something like 2.5. So in these models, the initial growth is going to be close to exponential, but eventually there are fewer and fewer susceptible people. The infected people don't meet susceptible susceptible people. They meet other infected people. They meet recovered people. They don't spread the disease to new susceptible people. And the epidemic slows. And eventually, when you get you get to herd immunity, when 1 over R0 people are susceptible. Okay, you'll have a little bit of transmission beyond that point, but basically the disease will start to die off then. So that's a pretty pessimistic picture. If R0 is 2.5, that suggests you're going to need 60% of people to be infected before the disease slows down. Okay, so that's the canonical model. Now, what about mortality? Well, you could just add an element to this, allow the total deaths to be equal to the number of people who are ever infected times the infection fatality rate. And there we know from microdata, and here comes the calibration part, we know that older people are more likely to die. We know that there's obesity is correlated. If you just use Chinese data, for example, and then you look at the difference in death rates by demographics, you expect a 5-fold difference between developed countries and low-income countries in mortality just based on the fact that there aren't so many old people in very poor countries. Obesity would strengthen that effect, but on the other hand, there could be some things that would work the opposite direction. If you have a weak healthcare system, which low-income countries do, you might expect more mortality. If you've got a lot of air pollution, maybe you'd expect more mortality. So, but let's say we're expecting something like a 5-fold difference from this factor. Let me argue that that's not going to fully explain these differences. Again, not inconsistent with the preferred specification in the paper. Okay, so the death toll in the UK, where I happen to be right now, is greater than the death toll in low and middle income countries representing half the world population. That's a more than 50-fold difference in the death. So it's not a 5-fold difference. It's much, much bigger than that. But there's another thing here, which is this, the main regressions in the paper are they don't exploit the time dimension. They're all about the deaths at the cumulative deaths. We've got a lot more information by taking advantage of the time path. And if you look at the time path, and this was clear in the charts that Penny showed, this shows you have a much, much flatter curve for low-income countries or lower middle-income countries than in the OECD epidemics. This is from Lee, 2020. So you can see that it's not, you really don't see this shape of this rapid exponential growth at the beginning in low-income countries that you do in high-income countries. You don't see that in low-income countries. So something else is going on. And remember, it's not, if it was just something affecting the fatality rate, then we'd have the same shape of the curve. It would just be 1/5 as large at any point. It's not that. It's a different shape of the curve, a different trajectory. So if bringing in a little bit of the epidemiological model suggests that there's more going on than just things that would affect the death rate. I mean, maybe you could tell some story why demographics affects the infection rate, but would probably go the opposite way. Older people probably get out less. So, okay. So why is the curve both lower, but critically also flatter? Well, could it be measurement error? Well, Penny argued it's just not big enough. And I think that's right, but there's another issue here, which is if you want to explain the flatness of the curve, you would need the implausible downward trend in the fraction of COVID-19 deaths that are attributed to COVID. So just to be clear, it's very plausible that in low-income countries, there are a lot of COVID deaths that never get attributed to COVID, that's for sure. But it's hard to tell a story, not impossible. We try to be creative in this profession, but so it's not impossible to tell a story why you'd be missing more and more of those deaths over time. But that's the type of story you would have to tell. You'd have to be missing incredibly more of those deaths to explain why the curve is flatter, not just why it's lower, but why it's flatter. So I don't think that can be the story. What about a shorter gap between the epidemic arriving and lockdown measures? Well, under a standard epidemiological model, all that matters, you're going to get to that herd immunity. This is what if the parameters, if those beta parameters, the contact rates go back up to normal after a lockdown, you go right back up to, you're going to go to herd immunity just as you would otherwise. So that's, you'll go to that 60% prevalence. So that doesn't seem to be doing it. I don't want to speak too strongly. There's a lot we don't know, but it's certainly if we take the data in this paper, the policy variables don't seem sufficient to explain the results. Obviously, as was pointed out, maybe you could tell a more complicated story. I don't want to rule that out, but it's not easy. I'm going to suggest another hypothesis. Endogenous behavior change possibly could get you there. You'd probably still get to the same herd immunity level because if individual behavior change depends on the risk, then you'll get to the same place. Or roughly the same place. Let me suggest an alternative hypothesis. And this is very speculative, just to be clear. I don't have evidence for this. I'm working on this, hope to get there, but right now just take this as speculation. So there's lots of reasons to think that epidemiological parameters might be heterogeneous across communities. We know from microevidence that there's very high transmission in places like nursing homes and bars and meatpacking plants. There are certain groups of people that are present there. We also know that there are some potential factors that are correlated with income, temperature, ventilation, what type of house you have, or other things, time spent outdoors, the pattern of social interaction. So consider a model with different types of subcommunities and some limited interaction across groups. So imagine there's a low prevalence subcommunity that's 20% of the population with an R0 of 2.6. And imagine there's a high prevalence subcommunity. And I'll consider a few different cases. You could think about R0 of 1.1. You could also think of an R0. Let me make it even more stark case, an R0 of 0.8. So what's going to happen when we do what the epidemiologists often do? I don't want to say as if they're a single group, but take the sort of standard epidemiological models, the canonical models. Well, when you think, let's think about I'm sorry, that I see my slide is backwards, where it says low prevalence. That should not be low prevalence. That should be high R0 and low R0. Think of the low R0 as 0.8, not as 1.1. Okay. Think about what happens if that's the real world and you go out and you try to estimate R0. Well, where R0 is 0.8, you're not going to see any takeoff of the epidemic. But where R0 is 2.6, you're going to see the epidemic take off. And you're going to estimate that R0 is 2.6 based on the early data. And you'll come to the conclusion that we need 60–70% of the population infected before we get to herd immunity. In fact, you need 60 or 70% of the high R0 communities infected. That's all. And so once you get to 15 or 20% prevalence, you'll be done. Okay. So that would be consistent with some of the data that we see, and without necessarily saying that policy played a key role. I don't want to claim that policy played no role, but this is obviously not a true model of the world, but I think it gives you food for thought. Let me skip over this slide, but I think it illustrates slightly more nuanced version of this. Let me note that optimal policy in this world with heterogeneity is going to be very sensitive to parameters. So let's assume that governments can put in containment measures that are costly, have economic costs, and that cut the spread rate by 25%. Well, if the high R0 groups have already reached herd immunity, and R0 in the low spreader group is less than 1, then containment measures are going to be unnecessary because we're already there we're already at herd immunity in the high groups, and we don't need this in the low groups, and we can just relax, no problem. We don't need all these lockdown measures. On the other hand, imagine the low group has R0 of 1.2 without the containment policies. Well, then relaxing the containment measures is potentially costly. So, what would be a conclusion from this? I guess the conclusion is that we might think that epidemiology is easier than macro, but it's actually pretty hard. Things are very sensitive to the details of how you specify things and how you construct the model. But I will note one cause for possible optimism, which is we often talk about lockdown measures as a binary variable, but actually there's a whole bunch of different policies, and they vary in their likely impacts on spread of the disease, but also in their economic and social and even health side effects. There are some fairly low-cost measures like masking or restrictions on nightclubs where the disease spreads a lot. There are other things like shutting down trade or shutting down immunizations for kids that have very high economic or social costs and that may not do that much to prevent the spread of the epidemic. So we could perhaps continuously vary these things. Now that suggests if we have a lot of uncertainty about the model and about the parameters, what could we do? Well, you could do repeated prevalence surveys so you track what's happening to the epidemic over time. Then you could progressively relax the restrictions with the lowest epidemiological risks and the highest economic benefits. And start out by saying, well, we're gonna allow basic mobility, but keep the nightclubs closed. If you're monitoring R throughout this process, then when the R starts to go up and you get close to R starts to go above 1, you can apply the brakes. Let me note that this policy makes sense for an individual country trying to control the epidemic. But I want to emphasize that as we do this, we'll start to learn. Right now, I threw out this possible heterogeneous story with heterogeneity, but I don't want to claim there's evidence for that. But if we started to do these types of surveys, we might notice some patterns. We might see, for example, that actually, perhaps in rural areas of low-income countries, it looks like R0 is less than 1, even without containment. Well, in that case, you could actually have pretty relaxed policies in those areas. But maybe in other places, maybe in urban slums, for example, it looks like R0 is greater than 1 unless you have containment policies. And then maybe we say, well, those places, we need those policies. I should note, I just want to emphasize something that Penny mentioned, but I think is very important. Now, these containment policies are causing huge amounts of suffering. The disease causes huge amounts of suffering, but we really need to know where the containment policy, where containment policy is necessary, where are they not necessary, and which containment policies are most effective. And if we can start to get to the frontier of choosing those policies in a smarter way, then which obviously was, there was so much uncertainty at the beginning. I'm not saying that I don't want to second guess decisions that were made, but if we can collect the data, then we can get to a point where we can choose policies that will allow the economies to recover and prevent some of the terrible suffering that people are undergoing from the economic and social consequences of the lockdowns, but also will be effective in avoiding unacceptable spread of the disease.
Thanks very much, Michael, and thanks very much for everybody in the session. We are over and we haven't had time for any questions.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.